Hello everyone, my name is 4AS and welcome to my channel. This is a series of video essays where I cover political, economic and revolutionary topics which are relevant to our time. I read the books so you don't have to. In a world where money rules the land, there is one critique that is left unspoken. Integrity leads to innovation. Innovation leads to inequity. Inequity leads to insanity. Join me as we explore the four eyes of capitalism. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing for more content in the future. Now, this video essay follows on from my last essay because I felt I could go into anti-capitalism in far more detail. It is a broad topic, so I want to do it justice today. While this book has been out for a while, since 2019 to be exact, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century by Erik Olin Wrights has been the best book I've read all year. In the broad spectrum of leftist politics, people are very good at speculating on what should be done, maybe even arguing for the best kind of society in the optimal conditions. But it's not every day you come across a concrete, step-by-step, pragmatic representation of how we could bring about a better future starting from today. That is a rare breed of book. But I suppose you've heard of the word socialist. Hell, you've heard of the word communist. But what about anti-capitalist? Well, before we talk about anti-capitalism, we must put forth what we mean by capitalism. Throughout this book, I will use the term capitalism to designate both the idea of capitalism as a market economy and the idea that it is organized through a particular kind of class structure. One way of thinking about this combination is that the market dimension identifies the basic mechanism of coordination through decentralized voluntary exchanges, supply and demand, and prices. And the class structure identifies the central power relations within the economic system between private owners of capital and workers. Ultimately, what you have are the market structures. You have wheat that I have, and I have steel that you want. Let's make a deal. And class structures, those who own the private property and those who are the workers. Anti-capitalism is broken into two types of camps when it comes to problems within the class and market structures within a capitalist system. Two general kinds of motivations are in play in these diverse forms of struggle within and over capitalism: class interests and moral values. You can oppose capitalism because it harms your own material interests, but also because it offends certain moral values that are important to you. This is why Erik critiques traditional Marxism in his book. Not everyone can be neatly filed under workers and capitalists. But for many other people in capitalist economics, things are not so straightforward. Highly educated professionals, managers, and many self-employed people, for example, occupy what I have called contradictory locations within class relations and have quite complex and often inconsistent interests with respect to capitalism. What's interesting is that to get a movement going, the class concerns cannot live without the moral concerns, and vice versa. It's all well and good to say there is an inequality gap, and trust me, there is a lot of evidence of this. Look at Thomas Piketty. But this does not mean that rich countries have become poor. It is their governments which have become poor, which is very different. In fact, at the same time, private wealth, net of debt, has risen spectacularly. In the 1970s, private wealth represented 300% of the national income, whereas in 2015, it had risen to or exceeded 600% in all the rich countries. This prosperity in private wealth is due to multiple causes: the rise in property prices, conglomeration effects in larger metropolitan areas, the aging of the population and the decline of growth, which automatically increases savings accumulated in the past in relation to current income and contributes to inflating the prices of assets. And also, of course, the privatization of public assets and the rise in debt, which is held in one form or another by private owners via the banks. But if you have a bunch of managers and white-collar professionals that have an investment property, they may feel attacked if you start talking about expropriating private property, even if it's the multinational companies who are the ones causing harm in society. Equally, you may be in the right talking about hashtag free Assange and go on about a bunch of good talking points about why the Australian government should bring him home to Australia and not be extradited to America. But again, there's a possibility where you hand a flyer to someone on the street. They'll wave you away saying, "No thanks." To be blunt, they may find it hard to see how it affects them. I'm not going to lie. It's a difficult hybrid to manage, but a successful anti-capitalism movement needs to master both to get any traction. Now, this may seem vague at first, but I want you to hear me out. Erik Olin Wrights says that anti-capitalism are the pockets of resistance in any capitalist system. For every gain in economic growth, there is an equal struggle against exploitation and injustice within the system. From here, he proposes 5 strategies of anti-capitalism that fight the ills in society. These are smashing capitalism, dismantling capitalism, taming capitalism, resisting capitalism, and escaping capitalism. Now, smashing capitalism is the romantic and sexy version of anti-capitalism. It is the one tied to the Bolshevik origins, that the way to change the system and to deal with capitalism is to start a revolution. If you are a long-time viewer of the channel, you know how revolutionaries such as Rosa and Lenin talked about the constant cycle of crisis, and by building relationships and class consciousness with fellow workers, a workers' party or vanguard can overthrow the system. Do you hear the people sing? You know, that sort of thing. The problem for a revolutionary party, therefore, is to be in a position to take advantage of the opportunity created by such system-level crises, to lead a mass mobilization to seize state power, either through elections or through an insurrectionary overthrow of existing regimes. Once in control of the state, the first task is to rapidly refashion the state itself to make it a suitable weapon of ruptural transformation. But as Lenin has said in left-wing communism, a country has to yield to the mood for revolution before you can make a move, and the question you have to ask yourself is, would a revolution happen tomorrow? The whole point of the book is analyzing an anti-capitalist struggle in a capitalist market economy, and smashing capitalism as a tactic seems unlikely. There are too many moving parts, too much complexity, and too many unintended consequences. As a result, attempts at system rupture will inevitably tend to unravel into such chaos that revolutionary elites, regardless of their motives, will be compelled to resort to pervasive violence and repression to sustain social order. Such violence, in turn, destroys the possibility for a genuinely democratic, participatory process of building a new society. The new strategy is dismantling capitalism, which is tied to the reformist thinking of anti-capitalism movements. Here the strategy was, instead of rupturing the system, it was to take control of the system and change it to suit leftist ideology. Rather, there would be a gradual dismantling of capitalism and the building up of the alternative through the sustained action of the state. The critical preconditions for this strategy to be viable was first a stable electoral democracy, and second a broad mass-based socialist party capable of winning elections and staying in power for a sufficiently long time that these new state-run economic structures could be robustly institutionalized. But as David Harvey points out, there was reformism, just not to capitalism. Neoliberalism had different ideas. There was in this a clear political threat to economic elites and ruling classes everywhere, both in the advanced capitalist countries and the many developing countries. The coup in Chile and the military takeover in Argentina, promoted internally by the upper classes with US support, provided one kind of solution. The subsequent Chilean experiment with neoliberalism demonstrated that the benefits of revived capitalist accumulation were highly skewed under forced privatization. With the rise of coups in developing countries and the Red Scares or Reds Under Beds campaign in developed countries, dismantling was abandoned. Then came Taming Capitalism. And this is what you would consider modern politics, where social democratic parties or labor parties have tried to tame capitalism via regulation and legislation. A recent example is the increased natural disasters in Australia. Means capitalism can't continue the way it's been. That is, a reliance on fossil fuels and the energy industry as is. The ALP government legislated a floor target of 43% reduction of carbon emissions by 2030. Capitalism, when left to its own devices, creates harms. It generates levels of inequality that are destructive to social cohesion. It destroys traditional jobs and leaves people to fend for themselves. Capitalism does not have to be left to its own devices. It can be tamed by well-crafted state policies. In a sense, a status quo is formed in this form of anti-capitalism movement. An Overton window is formed where there are certain progressive policies or capitalist privileges that are seen as faux pas to create policy against. An example would be for a conservative government in Australia attacking the Medicare health system, which was an unpopular tactic when they tried to implement a Medicare co-payment. Similarly, Bill Shorten lost the 2019 election around miscommunication of how he would legislate on franking credits and investments. It's not that the state apparatus can't make a difference, it's just that they have a limited scope. Resisting capitalism, in contrast, are social movements which are more involved with boots on the ground and ordinary citizens within a capitalist society. This concerns the more romantic notions of protest and civil disobedience, where a government, state apparatus, or private company has brought out an unpopular ruling that the people wish to change their minds about. Resisting capitalism seeks to elevate the harms of the system, but does not attempt to capture state power. Rather, it seeks to affect the behavior of capitalists and political elites through protests and other forms of resistance outside of the state. And it's not like it doesn't get results. Recently, in Australian politics, the protests and commentary surrounding #Free Assange has caused the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to comment on the matter, remarking that enough is enough. The resistance against the detention of Julian Assange has caused the Australian government to speak out against the USA, which it considers a strong ally, even if it's a soft agreement that something should be done. Finally, the last stream of anti-capitalist movement is escaping capitalism. This is the type of movement that rejects the capitalist market system in some way, shape, or form. A common example of this is a company ownership type I've talked about quite a bit, a cooperative. Instead of caring for shareholders in a private company or advocating for specific members or a board in a non-for-profit company, a cooperative is an ownership structure which is run by the workers and for the workers. They can decide if not making a profit this year is a problem or not. Maybe they want to specialize in a certain product for the market, therefore continual growth may not be a factor. Certainly, cooperatives, which are often motivated mainly by a desire to escape the authoritarian workplaces and exploitation of capitalist firms, can also become elements of a broader challenge to capitalism and building blocks of an alternative form of economy. But this makes sense in a movement which is trying to overcome the dictatorship that can be formed in a business. When a worker comes on board in a private company, they have a specific job criteria, and any stray outside of this criteria is seen as unproductive. Instead, structures like cooperatives try to reinvent how workers interact with businesses. Now, at this point, Erik Olin Wrights brings together resisting and taming capitalism, which tries to neutralize the harms of capitalism, and, on the other hand, dismantling and escaping capitalism, which promote transcending structures to capitalism. This combination creates eroding capitalism. One way to challenge capitalism is to build more democratic, egalitarian, participatory economic relations where possible in the spaces and cracks within this complex system. The idea of eroding capitalism imagines that these alternatives have the potential in the long run to become sufficiently prominent in the lives of individuals and communities that capitalism could eventually be displaced from its dominant role in the system. Erik goes on to describe an analogy that eroding capitalism is akin to having an ecosystem with a variety of flora and fauna. If you introduce an alien species that thrives in the environment, it will change the relationship of various elements of the flora and fauna to the habitat. The new species ends up changing the system. The class and moral aspect of anti-capitalist movements working in tandem end up changing the system on a whole. Now, besides biologists being horrified with that sort of analogy, there is a point to be made. The reason capitalism functions like it does now is due to the various status quo inputs and outputs that exist within it in society. If you change the status quo, then the current structure may erode away. For example, say a scenario where cooperatives end up achieving a plural ownership proliferation in Western societies. Society sees that workers owning a business is a viable option for them, and they know the risks. It is safe to say that the economy would look very different to what we have currently. In this alternate universe, the cooperative economy could be far more reaching apart from specific places in Europe and small businesses in Western countries. Maybe we might find that cooperatives are far more resilient, and we find out, like with Mondragon and the failure of Fagor, like I've talked about previously, businesses are able to share workers and not make them redundant. Now, that is definitely something to ponder if we find ourselves in a situation where we can erode capitalism in society. If you haven't already, like, share, and subscribe for more content in the future. And remember, folks, to keep thinking and keep learning. Goodbye till next time.